Let me just see if I can. There. Good. There we go. So, let's give just a quick overview of where we're heading in the next little bit, and then I will take your questions about the assignment. So, this week, we are talking about user authentication. That is to say, we're primarily going to be talking about password systems, username, password, login systems, which is, it's the best, most commonly used solution to the problem of user authentication. Next week, we will talk about Laravel. Laravel is a framework for PHP. It takes many of the common functions which we have been discussing and doing in raw PHP and provides you libraries which sort of do them to some degree of automation. Laravel is a course unto itself if you are sort of in the software development stream. So we're going to be doing it at the level of the most bare basics. But that should give us enough to, get into we should have enough to get into a couple of interesting examples. And hopefully you'll see the utility in it. That's the primary purpose of presenting this Laravel material to you, is that you can recognize, the utility in this, having had to do a bunch of stuff by hand so far. Then, in the final week, we will have exam review. If we have time for it, we can talk a little bit about PHP security. And then after that, it's the exam, and then that's the course. So, yay! Hurrah! Huzzah! And everybody will pass the exam with 100%. And I'll stake my reputation on it. No, I won't. That's a foolish thing to do. So, let's talk about the assignment 5. Are you talking about the multi-page survey or the patient management system?
The survey.
Cool.
So my question is, Dr. Moore, it doesn't mention anything about verifying, the server verifying the entry of the user in this case. It looks like the survey, you're just kind of going from page to page without any verifications. Are you expecting any server-side verifications?
Give me a moment to take a look through this thing. No, it doesn't seem so. Now, that's definitely in the category of things, if you have included some validity checks, good, you know. They're not necessarily worth marks, but certainly if you were doing one of these for real, the validity checks would need to be there. Even if you want to keep it simple, like, was this field filled out, right? That being said, there's nothing explicitly in this assignment document calling for it. There are no grades allocated to it. The point of this primarily is to exercise your knowledge of sessions. Does that make sense?
Second question.
Mm-hmm.
Page 5 of the assignment is a summary page.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you click that, you're just simply loading a thank you page.
Yes.
What happens to the data?
Good morning.
Good morning. Hey, is that open?
Yeah.
He unlocked it permanently, eh? Okay, cool. Good. Nothing. You'll notice there's nothing in here about hooking it up to a database or saving it to a file or doing any of those types of CRUD operations. Again, the scope of this assignment has been intentionally restricted to working with sessions. See, the problem is by this point in the course, we have enough moving parts in these types of things that if we wanted to crush you with an assignment that says use everything you've learned so far, you know, you're talking less assignment and more project, right? So no, this assignment has a more limited scope than previous. Assignment 4 I think was reasonably solid in terms of content. This one's been pared down. So
Perfect.
yep. Any questions?
If I have a question.
Yes.
For third and fourth page, reader have to enter their healthcare related information, right? What kind of form, that form should we use? Like a text area, so like open end?
It's up to you. This is you get to design a couple of pages. It should be, it should be relevant to the particular survey you're making, like on the topic you're making it. For example, perhaps your survey is meant to track prevalence of sort of respiratory infections in geographic areas, right? You would have, how many times in the last year have you had a cold? How many times have you had the flu? How many times how many times did you have a cold and it required you to be away from work? How many times have you been away from work for more than 3 days or something? Some questions that you could have to judge the severity of whatever it is that you're asking about. You are free to use whatever HTML input elements make sense for the type of survey that you're asking. There's no particular restriction on which ones you are to use. We already tested you on whether you know them all, right? So if you want to make it entirely multiple choice radio buttons, that's okay. If you want to combine that with text inputs or checkbox inputs, these are kind of the things I'm typically expecting. I think the front page has first name, last name, and birthday, so age is also one that's usually relevant to healthcare. So just whatever mix of items you think is useful, relevant, pertinent to whatever you're trying to collect information on. Does that make sense?
So which means there is no limitation of the number of questions each page.
Well, if you take a look at the instructions at the top, there is kind of a suggestion that
7 to 12 questions?
7 to 12 things is as many as any one page of a multi-page survey should have. However, because this is an assignment, you know,
I've got 2 or 3.
yeah, I was gonna say 3 to 4.
Per page, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say 3 to 4 is probably plenty.
Per
So-
page?
Per page, yeah.
Other than page 2, which has everything.
So page 1 would be like a welcome page, and
Well, first page, you must enter first name, last name, birthday. Second page is country, province, city, address, and phone number. And then the next 2 pages are any relevant medical information, you know, age, sex, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I shouldn't have to tell you, you guys are medical professionals, so.
I have a question, so if the user skip 1 or 2 questions, so it should give us an error?
There is actually no requirement for validation of that type in the assignment document. Yeah, there's also no grades given for the validation of the inputs. If you wish to do that, it's certainly good practice. Given that that was one of the major topics of one of the assignments we had in the class, you can probably expect something on the exam to be related to those types of topics. So getting some practice in might not be a bad idea, but it's not for marks.
Okay.
Are there any other questions about assignment 5?
What the rubric
Oh,
is for?
sure.
The third line is page forms with next is submit. So I think this question is similar to Phil's, but what does that mean submit? We need to submit to
You have to have a button.
or just the next page?
So
Magic.
let's think about HTML forms for a moment, right? On an HTML form, let me back up. Multiple pages. Multiple pages implies multiple forms. The client needs some way of communicating to the server what the contents of the form were, right? It's gonna be a post request, right? Each form will make its own post request. What is the input element which actually sends the request?
Is sent?
Not sent,
No.
it's actually got its own it's got its own input type.
Button primary?
Oh, that's a bootstrap class. It's a submit button, right? Input type equals submit, right? So, because it's a multi-page survey, not every submit button should be a final submit button, right? Like, to the user, what submitting the survey means is different from what HTML thinks of when it submits a form, right? The end user is thinking, I am submitting the whole survey. It's like, I see the summary, submit, right? But with respect to the forms, every form will have a submit button. The submit button is what gets you to the next page, right? So, for user experience, we don't call it submit. We call it next, right? We label the button next, even though technically speaking, it's a submit form element. So that's why here it says next/submit. It's because some of them are labeled next, some of them are labeled submit, but they are all submit buttons.
But the button, which works for moving to from 5th page to 6th page, no need to use submit button, because there is no information to move on to next page.
Well, you do need to know that you're moving to the next page.
But just, server or HTML will know.
So ordinarily, what the purpose of the review page is to review the items that have been entered, and if you need to modify something, you typically, it's not in this assignment, but typically you have like a little progress bar at the top of these things or something where you can click back through previous elements of the survey to correct things, right? So while the final submit button on page 5 does not send any new data, the fact that it's been clicked is confirmation that the data already contained in the session variable is valid. Before that, you don't know that it's valid. So, if this were hooked up to a CRUD operation, that submit button, that final page 5 submit button, would finally perform an insert operation on the database.
Yeah, technically, but in this assignment, we don't have to.
Well, you do, because you have to go from page 5 to page 6.
Yes.
So which means is because I have to retrieve the database later after the revised,
Well,
the survey.
no, it's like how does the PHP know that you are requesting page 6?
So in my head, now I'm just thinking button attribute, using button attribute, like on click and then go to next page or something like that.
Well,
Location of HREF.
you folks haven't been given any starter code for this, have you?
No.
No. Well,
You could even, if you think about it this way, instead of calling it submit on your summary page, you can call it complete.
yes. Yes.
Has the same function. I'm just moving from page 5 to page 6. Doesn't have to do it displaying. Thank you for
So
doing your thing.
there are a couple of ways that you can do this, right? There is the MVC architecture way of doing this, and then there is the sort of raw PHP way of doing this, right? So the raw PHP way of doing this is that you will have page1.php page2.php, right? Page 3, etc. Right? This is the raw PHP. These PHP files will contain the session variable and they'll maintain the session, they'll add to the session variable, all of that stuff, right? Which means that a lot of stuff's going to be duplicated between these different files, right? If you want to take an MVC architecture approach, you have the controller, PHP, It takes care of establishing and loading the session, right? It takes care of processing any of the inputs that are incoming. You're going to have to pass to it which page you're on, right? So it's kind of the difference between requesting the page directly, like in your form, making action equal page3.php, right? It's the difference between doing that and saying something like action equals control.php question mark page is equal to 1 or page is equal to 3 in this case. And then you can send along whatever else you want, right? Or just let the form take care of that for you, right? So if you send this, page gets picked up as a get parameter mixed in with the post parameters from the actual form data, which means that using this on all of your forms allows you to come in through control.php. It then includes whichever of these files is called for in a particular situation, right? Which is good, right? Or if you don't want to go that route, you could even you could say something like next is equal to true, right? Or something like that. The session variable itself can hold what page the user is on, right? And then next just means you increment that variable and then go to the next page, right? There are advantages and disadvantages to both, but you can do both, right? So if you want to do it in an MVC kind of a way, which, you know, requires less fiddling with the session variable, right? Overall, this will be less work, right? That's what I recommend, but as you can see here, no marks for that using one architecture over the other, right? So taking this approach and not having the controller, the work is more repetitive and tedious. However, you don't, it's not necessary for you to use any of the tricks that were picked up in the MVC lesson, right? Now, as MVC architecture goes, there's practically no model here. It's almost just a, VC architecture, because there's no hooking it up. There's nothing hooking it up to a database. We're not actually saving the survey results anywhere, right? So we're not, the controller is really quite lightweight here. All it's doing really is recognizing which page sent the request, which page is being requested, and then store the data that's been sent along to the session variable. And that's pretty much it. Does that make sense?
I have another question.
Okay.
So on each page, we have to have a previous button as well, so that the customer, or it's not required, but can you have that or no?
You certainly can have a previous button. I didn't see a requirement for that anywhere, but it certainly makes sense to have a previous button. It's also, if you configure it correctly, not even that much work.
I have any other questions, to ask for that?
Good. So,
6 pages total.
hmm?
It says 6 pages total.
Yep. This one is,
Tricky.
I was going to say easier than the last assignment.
It's kind of easy, but it's tricky, like you can mess up a lot of things.
Well, it leaves more to your design than previous ones have, but overall, the PHP code that you're writing here is relatively straightforward relative to previous tasks. Is anybody actually attempting this one?
No.
It's requiring today's work actually, so.
So either we have to do this one or the other one, or it's.
Yeah,
we
you
have-
are to do one of these, but not both.
Okay. Because I saw 2 of them are due on 7th, so I thought like both of them is required.
Oh, heck no. No.
Okay.
All right.
Then we have a final one.
Yep, Laravel. Do the 14th. So I realize that's like a reasonably tight time frame, but kind of just the way it worked out.
Professor, I have a question.
Yeah.
The exam is open book, similar to the midterm, or no?
Yeah, the exam's going to be very similar to the midterm. Hopefully we're all here for that.
So are you going to provide the practice quiz with the final?
Yes, there's a practice final the same way as there was for the test. Good.
I'll be doing my midterm tomorrow,
Okay, cool. Good.
hopefully tomorrow.
Sounds good. When you do it, I will grade it. I apologize, I'm a little bit behind on my grading at the moment. There's been a lot of
There's another teacher who's behind that too, and it's piling up so many.
well, as behind goes, I'm not super behind, but it's like,
This time you're better than before, so.
yeah. It was, yeah. Anyway, I'm making a conscious effort to be better at it this semester.
You are.
So,
The user-centered design is like
We are doing a lot of mistakes. We are doing a lot of mistakes.
all right. This used to be my trademark. I used to have a light up one, but then it broke. And now, this one's like, doesn't even have any electronic components, so I'm hoping it'll be a bit more solid. I was hoping for a light up one though. Amazon lied to me. It's okay. So, user authentication and authorization. So, as previously stated, this is primarily a password system. Password systems are the #1 way that we authenticate users. We're going to learn a bit about how these things are actually stored, how they're actually worked with, and by the end of this week, we will have produced a working example of this in PHP. So, user authentication. User authentication. When we verify the identity of the user attempting to access a resource. Basic definition. So the idea is that you are the only person who can access your account on my Canvas, my Mohawk, or any of the 15 bazillion things that you are required to log into on a daily basis. You need to log into each of these services, after which only you have access to them, in theory. So this is why it's a absolute ironclad principle of keeping yourself secure on the internet, that you absolutely never, ever, 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 ever share your password with anyone, with the possible exception of your spouse, if you trust your spouse, and even then you should change your password immediately afterwards. You should be the only person to have your password. So, for user authentication, there are typically three key operations. Number one, obviously we need to log the user in. Without the ability to log the user in, we have nothing. Secondly, we need to log a user out. When a user is completed whatever task that they needed to do, or if they kind of just dropped their session and went away and had coffee or something, your system should know to log the user out when they are finished or when they give the appearance of being finished. Third, we need to grant access or not to a user. So, just because you're logged into a system does not mean you have full access to everything on that system. Different users exist at different levels of privilege. Think about, top secret classified military information, right? Just because you're a private in the Army does not mean that you get to see all of the general's battle plans, right? So, even if you are logged in, we still need the ability to check your level of privilege to make sure that you're accessing something that you have the right to access. Actually, a very simple example of this, right? When you are logged in as a user, let's say it's a GitHub account and you're accessing a settings page, something like that. You have an account, you're accessing the account settings. Should you have access to anybody else's settings? Probably not. If you try to access them, what should happen? Digital equivalent of being slapped on the wrist, which is normally just a redirect to a page that says, looks like you're trying to access something you don't actually have access to.
But if you're admin, you can access something. If you're
Well,
the one who has all the privileges.
Yes. So even among administrators, there are levels of privilege, right? Have I told you folks about the principle of least privilege?
No.
Okay, so this is a design pattern, right? When you're trying to manage not only people, but also programs, in general, the best security practice is to only give them as much access as they require to perform their task and not one drop more. So everybody should have the least necessary privilege, right? The least amount of privilege necessary for their function. For example, you described to me in the hospital, you have some sort of cabinet where you scan yourself in and it gives you access to only certain medicines in the cabinet, right? Somebody has to load the cabinet.
Pharmacy.
Right. They have elevated levels of privilege on the cabinet, but they wouldn't have complete levels of privilege on that cabinet. For example, the pharmacist would not have the ability to elevate anybody else's privileges to the level of pharmacist. right? And that is very much an administrator operation, right? So that's like, you kind of have to think a little bit like that if you're talking about, like you're not necessarily talking about administrating like the system, you are an administrator, you know, like we call secretaries administrators now, you know, sort of thing. What you're talking about is like administrator privileges from like a networking class type perspective, right? So, often, when solving user authentication problems, we need to redirect users to another page. We've already seen an example of this. When we did our example last week, if we did not have a logged in authenticated user, we directed them to a login page. Does anybody remember how we did that? What architecture were we using? Remember, we were building on a previous example, right? We were building on a previous example using MVC architecture. We were integrating a login system into it. We wanted two different pages. One is the database access, the other is a login page. So we had two view files in our MVC app. We selected between those two view files depending on the authentication state of the user, which was tracked by, what were we using to track the authentication state of the user? Starts with an S. S-E,
Set?
S-E-S.
Session.
Yes, we were using a session.
Yeah.
So My Canvas does this as well. If you try to access a link on My Canvas but they're not logged in, you will be directed to the login page. So sometimes when people get this, they think that the link isn't working. It's like, oh, I got a link, this link isn't working. But actually, the link is working. You are accessing the page you think you're accessing. It's just refusing to let you in, and then it's redirecting you somewhere where you can authenticate. So, we can redirect a user with the header function. So the way that we did it in class was,
Thank God.
we can use MVC architecture, but we can also include a location parameter in the header. So, the function call header location login.php will redirect the user to the login.php script. It does this by setting an HTTPS header. When the response is sent to the browser will make a request for login.php, which is at the same root, so located in the same folder. Important, we cannot have any HTML or other output before running the header function. So the way that the header function works, right? Remember that anything that's echoed into the PHP, anything echoed by a PHP script is being produced as HTML, right? If there's so in order to write into the header, you have to write it first, right? So not only does the header have to be written to before any PHP echo statements, it also has to be written to before you include any HTML code outside of PHP. Right? So your PHP tag must start right at the very top of the file, and, oops, sorry, I've got a piece of wood in my sock. That's not bad. Can you tell what's going on at my house right now?
Is there a construction going on?
A little bit, yep.
Okay.
I mean, it's been ongoing for a couple of years, you know. Basically, that's what I do, is like, by day I teach, by night I do stealth carpentry while the kids are sleeping. So, our one kid, like, we had plumbers in, laying new pipe and like breaking up the concrete with a jackhammer. One of the kids slept through a jackhammer at the basement. It was like, wow.
That's
If only that was every night. Except it was during the day.
That's, they have a deep sleep.
Yeah.
Only during the day, not at night.
When they take their naps.
Thank God I don't have kids right now.
Anyway, so let me illustrate this point then.
What if you do have something inserted, Dr. Moore, before that function call? Will it just be ignored? Any outputs? It would just be ignored then?
I believe what it will do is include that phrase into the payload rather than into the header.
Okay.
And this is kind of just like one of the stupid little ways that PHP works. Because PHP is an interpreted language and it doesn't do look back. But, you know, let's do a quick demo.
Yeah.
So let's get XAMPP running. XAMPP, htdocs. Let's make a new folder. 2024-03-26. There we go. So I'm going to make a new file. Make this page1.php. Make another one, page2.php. There we go, page1 and 2.php. Localhost and 80//2024-03-36. There we go. See, we have page 1 and page 2 empty PHP files. So let's have page2.php, which could just be an HTML page for what I'm going to use it for. Say, you have been redirected to page 2. Although I have to say, if page 2 has been accessed directly, there's no way for it to know whether something redirected to it, right? So, okay, good. Page 2, page 1. I can say H1, this is the page doing the redirecting. In fact, let's just throw all of that in there too. There we go. So if we take a look, this is the page redoing the redirecting. We now call the header function, and we provide it location page2.php. So you'll notice we're providing this as a string, right? This is being written into the header. Save, reload. You have been redirected to page 2. And you'll notice that if we go back to here, page 1 is never even pops up, right? You are immediately transported to page 2. I know that sometimes you'll see pages do this sort of wait 3 seconds, let the user know they're being redirected, and then redirect them. That's like a different process. It's actually a lot more involved. This is the simple, quick way of doing it. Make sense? Any questions? Well, except for the one where we demonstrate how to break it.
Then how can we control to move on to next page in this page 1?
Oh, well, you would have to use some other method than the header. Right?
In the header function.
Yes, you would have to do it in JavaScript, I'm pretty sure. Right? You would have to include some JavaScript on the page, which automatically did a page load request to the next page after like a 3-second timeout or something like that. That's not possible on the server side. This is how the server redirects.
Then if there is a button, and then can I control the header function by clicking buttons or something?
No. So the header function stays inside of PHP, right? It never leaves the server. There's basically no way. So in order to do something like that, the user would have had to send get or post parameters or something like that in order for you to know which page to direct them to, right? In this case, since it's just a straight URL access, you're not going to have any parameters, unless the user puts them in specifically. Like you can always put parameters in, right? But they don't have to be used, right? And you can't expect them to be there. So yeah, this is just like you should be logged in for this and you're not. So I'm going to send you to the login page. So, okie dokie.
So Professor, when you loaded the page 2, it directed to the page 1?
Other way. Page 1 directs to page 2. Notice?
No.
Here,
Can you go back?
page 1,
Yeah.
click. You have been redirected to page 2. That is the contents of page 2.
This is. Okay. Oh, that was, I don't know.
In fact,
I just other way around.
if we take a look at our network tab, you can see we have page 1 and page 2 both loaded. Page 1, there you go. Location, page2.php has been included. Make sense?
Yes.
So, here's a question. What happens if we put some text here? Oh, it's still, come on, Heather. This must be, again, this thing that thinks happens, but it doesn't. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it works fine no matter where you use it, apparently. Probably in older versions of PHP this wasn't the case. But it seems this information is old. So, still, it's good to have demonstrated it. It's good to have demonstrated how header location works. So, any questions about that before we move on?
Can you check mine why it's not working?
Do that?
So this is my page 1,
Mhm.
this is my page 2.
Mhm.
If I go back to my exam,
Mhm.
this is 1, page 1.
Alright.
It's up the other way around.
So, this is Opera, right? Oh, it's because you've called it page 2, not page 2. Every time, right?
Yes, it's me. Okay, thank you.
So,
What's going on? Now it's working.
good.
Okay, perfect.
So, everyone in this room has been required to log into many things many times, but now we will perhaps dig into the details a little bit and dissect, pick it apart, see what the anatomy of a login is. So, we can log in a user by presenting them with a login page, a form with inputs for username and password. We can search a database for a user with the given name and password. If the user does not exist or the password is incorrect, we present the user with an error message. So let's talk about user login error messages, right? You want them to be vague. You don't want them to give too much information. For example, let's say that the username is correct but the password is not. It is not good security practice to say user password invalid. That confirms that the user is in the database, which means that you are giving information about the contents of the database to anybody, right? So, what you say is something like login failure or username password combination invalid or something that doesn't tell you anything about, you know,
One part of the information is correct.
precisely, what you don't tell what part of the information is correct. This, like it used to be that websites would do that all the time. You may notice that these days it's a lot less so. Most of the time you just get something generic like login failure, please try again, something like that. If the username and password is correct, we can create a session key, for example, user, and set it to the username of the now logged in user. This is the exact approach that we were using in the last class. This identifies that the user has been successfully logged in and who. Typically, we redirect the user somewhere at this point, for example, to a dashboard or profile page. Of course, once the user has logged in, there's no point in remaining on the login page. So, what must exist in order for us to set a session key?
Can you repeat the question again?
So, we are authenticating a user by setting a value inside of the session superglobal. So what do we have to do first?
Enter the information.
Well, I
Username.
mean on the client side, yes. In PHP, what do we have to do before we can set this key inside of the session
We have
superglobal?
it in sometimes.
Well,
We have to
yeah,
create the username and password first.
you have to receive the username and password, absolutely. You have to validate the credential, yes. What do you have to do then? What do we need to do in order that we can add this to the session superglobal? The session superglobal, which may or may not exist. Can you write to a variable before you initialize it? Session start. Very good. In order to set a user variable in the session, you must have a session to set them. When a user attempts to access a page, whether by clicking on a link or entering a URL, our script can use the session key to verify if a user is logged in. If the session key does not exist, then the user is not logged in and therefore should not have access to the resource. At this point, we typically redirect the user to the login page once again. If the session key does exist, then a user is logged in and we can give them access to the resource, i.e. we can load the page as normal. If you want to get more complicated with this, one of the things that should be stored in the credentials database is the level of privilege that the user has. The level of privilege that the user has should be stored in the session superglobal. Remember that this information is never made public, it never escapes the server, so it's not a security risk to do so. If you store what level of access the user should have in the session superglobal, then you can make further decisions about what operations are permitted and where, the level of operations which are permitted, etc. So, for example, let's extend our example with the medicine cabinet, the automated medicine cabinet, and pharmacists. Let's say we have in our system 2 levels of privilege. We have, let's say, nurses and pharmacists, right? The nurses have the ability to remove medicines from the cabinet. Pharmacists have the ability to add and remove medicines from the cabinet. Make sense? Unless you keep track of that in the database, how's the computer supposed to know the difference between these two groups of people, right? You have to add that functionality. Make sense? Once we get our basic example working, we can work on getting something like that working too. So, finally, log out. When a user logs out, this is typically by clicking a link, we delete the session. We typically then redirect the user to another page at this point, either the login page or a home page, and the application no longer considers the user to be logged in. So we say that session has ended. All of the session variables, all of the values stored in the session superglobal should be at that point deleted. Anything that you want stored between sessions needs to go in the database. Very good. Logging out is like a relatively routine, like it's quite simple. You should provide a function for logging out, but it's not difficult to implement it.
I have a question.
Certainly.
So by deleting a session key, is that delete everything, like, his login history or anything like that? If somebody wants to check in, that if that user logged in before, how can we check that?
Login history is something that you can maintain in a database if you like, right?
But that session key, deleting that session key will not delete that information, right?
Certainly not. Deleting information from the session, it's not a database operation. It does not touch any of the data stored in the database. So, for example, a very typical thing that you include in a credentials table is a date stamp of last login. Perhaps not a complete login history. It depends on how you want the system configured, how much security you want on the system, right? Put it this way, when I log into CS Unix, it tells me when my last login was, but it doesn't tell me anything more than that, right? Maybe it keeps in track of it, I'm not sure. I don't think so, though. Depends on the system. But yes, I lost, what was your question again?
That's it, that's the question.
Cool. So, any other questions?
So what functions can be used to delete the information at all sessions?
There are 3 ways of doing it, right? Number 1, by unsetting the user key in the session superglobal, you are removing their authentication, but keeping the session live, and keeping all of the information in the session live, right? So, for example, let's say the content of our session superglobal was the following. User is Greg Bananas is 7. Likes coconut is false. Something like that. Right? So, you have 3 operations. I'll do it in 3 colors. Number 1, you have unset session at user. Right? This deletes only that entry. Since this is the entry we were using to determine whether or not this person was logged in, if you remove it, they are no longer logged in. But any additional information that's stored in the session superglobal will remain. This may not be the way that you want to go, actually, right? Because there might be sensitive information here. It's probably proactive security to just delete the whole thing, right? So, approach number 2. Oh man, you gonna be able to read that? Can you guys read that? No? You also have session unset. Session unset unsets all of the elements inside of the session, but does not destroy the session itself. It wipes it clean, but it leaves it in place. You don't have to reestablish a new session cookie ID.
Which means I don't have to set session start again.
Correct. You don't have to call session start again, right? Although you do in every time a PHP script loads anyways, but you know. So that deletes all of the contents but leaves this thing intact, right? Finally,
So first one, sorry, Professor, the first one keep the session alive, but it delete, but log out the user, or it's also like,
all 3 of these log the user out.
log the user, but keep the session alive. The
Yeah.
first one keep the session alive
Yep,
as
it
well?
keeps it alive and it keeps any non-user related information intact.
Yeah.
So this is the least destructive way of logging out.
Okay.
The most destructive way of logging out is session destroy. That attacks it at this level. It removes the session superglobal itself and everything in it, which means that after session destroy, if you want to start a new session, you have to call session start. It's as if the session never existed in the first place. Does that make sense? So here, you keep most of the data intact, you just de-authenticate the session. Here, you remove all of the information in the session, but you do not have to reissue a cookie. Here, you destroy everything and you have to reissue a cookie. So, of these 3, which one do you think is the most secure?
The
The
last
last one.
Yep. If the user has had their session cookie yoinked, session destroy will prevent a hacker from getting in as well. Whereas none of the other ones will. They don't protect against duplicated session cookies.
So Professor, we have to have a session destroy in our login program, right? So we should have it, right? If something, like for example, if there should be a time, how can I say that? We have to keep the session alive for a certain time, and then the destroy session has to apply to log out all the information, so, right?
It already does.
It already does?
Yeah, when you create a session cookie, it has a default expiry time of 21 minutes. So after 21 minutes, the next time the server cleans up all its dead sessions, it destroys them.
But if
Because-
you want to destroy before the 21 minutes, then the destroy method would be the best one.
Yep, you have a logout button. That logout button calls a PHP script that
Destroy.
calls session destroy.
So when is session onset used?
When is this used? I don't know. There's probably an application for it somewhere, but, what do you think? Maybe the website's doing additional tracking of you while you're not logged in. Right? Like, you're not logged in, but you were previously logged in, so they might be wanting to like track your activity or what you're doing while you're logged out, you know, for marketing purposes or whatever. Any other questions? So, authorization. Not all users should have access to all resources. Obviously. Just because you're logged into My Mohawk or My Canvas, it doesn't mean you have the same access level as an administrator. Another good example is our course shell on Canvas. I have elevated privileges on the course shell because I have to be able to do things like modify assignment documents. You folks do not, because that would be silly. Imagine the world we would live in if a student could modify an assignment document, right? Authorization is when we determine whether a logged-in user has access to a resource. So that's the name of the term, authorization. Author being derived from the word authority, which derives from the word author itself. An author is, the word author itself is derived from the word authentic, right? The author is the originator, it's the person in whom the authenticity rests, right? So when you say this person is the author of a book, they are the source of the authority for that book, right? So, sometimes that authority may not be, you know, deserved, but nevertheless, the fact is they wrote a book. So, when logging the user in, we will also need to record the user's access level as a session key. For example, student, instructor, admin, etc. When granting access to a page, we will also check the user's access level to see if it allows access to this thing or that thing. And this doesn't even have to be at the level of pages. This could be, you know, certain buttons just don't appear if you don't have access to those operations, that sort of thing. For example, only instructors can access the edit grade page on My Canvas. So, just as an example, these are the different sorts of, these are the different permission levels and operations that exist. I'm not sure this is toolset.com. I'm not sure where this is from, but basically, we have several levels of privilege, right? Guest, subscriber, premium customer, contributor, author, writer, editor, and administrator. Administrator has all privileges, and you can't take any privileges away. Editors have all privileges except preview any, whatever that does. Writers, the same level of privilege. Authors have the same privileges as writers, except they can't delete anything. Contributors, customers, subscribers, and guests all have the same level of privilege. They can only read. But you can imagine a world in which a contributor might be able to publish and edit their own, right? But they shouldn't be able to edit any, and they shouldn't be able to delete any, and perhaps you give them permission to delete their own or something like that, right? You can select the level of privilege that's appropriate by distinguishing people into these access levels. Make sense? Good. access levels can be represented as a two-dimensional grid or a 2D array of access levels and features and pages. We call this representation an access control list. We can use a PHP 2D array of Boolean values as an access control list. One dimension accesses levels, another dimension accesses features and pages. A true value indicates access to that feature by that access level. A false indicates no access should get granted. So, for example, in our example with medicines, if we have nurse, pharmacist, and perhaps pharmacy technician, all right. That's very long, but I'll write it anyway.
Pharmatech?
Pharmatech. There we go.
So the distinction with that one, Dr. Moore, is
And
they can add to the machine, they can't modify the quantities in the machine like pharmacists could.
sounds like we just introduced another level.
That's the higher level, yeah, you got it.
So pharmatech is the higher level,
No.
or pharmacist is
It's
the
the
higher?
highest level.
And then, what's someone
Least,
well, someone like under the level of a nurse who would not,
Phil.
would be able to,
Phil,
yeah, someone who can view things but can't make any modifications.
Phil.
Okay, Phil. There we go. You get your own access level. So, among these, right, we have sort of viewing privileges, right? So everybody gets to see what's in it, right? We would then have,
Modify,
well,
remove.
remove medicine, right? Or maybe even use, like remove or use. Right? The nurse would be able to do that. The pharmacist would be able to do that. Perhaps the pharmacy technician can't. Is that true?
Correct. They can only refill.
Refill, right? Pharmacist can do that, certainly. Pharmatech can do that. Nurses and you can't do that. And then you would have like certain additional things like, for example, add new medicine, right? Which only the pharmacist can do. Like, initialize the machine with a new type of medicine in to be able to dispense, right? So, you see we have a nice little grid going on here. So how do we represent this in our, in PHP, right? And the other thing to understand is like, this thing is part of the model, right? You may wish to have this hard-coded, right? In a sort of medical sense, I'm sure much of these interactions are governed by, if not like legal legislation, at least hospital policy, right? Is it actual provincial legislation?
Yes.
Oh, there you go.
For example, only an anesthetist or higher level doctor would have access to the narcotics.
Mm-hmm.
So a nurse could have access to medium level drugs.
Right.
The lower end of the system only has access to a
Tylenol.
basic, like
Yeah.
an antibiotic or something stupid.
Right.
Or maybe
Well,
Tylenol,
yeah.
so.
This is already sufficiently complicated though. So in terms of, yes?
Can I add it? Because to agree with Phil, and also there's a licensing associated with like each level of,
Yeah.
like, you
Mhm.
know.
Responsibility.
You have to pass some
Certification.
certifications to get yourself up this,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, let's take this and create one. Let's take our example that we were working on last time. And let's add this thing specifically, because it's just a 2D array. We actually should know everything we already, we should know everything we need to, right? Fundamentally, we're using associative arrays for this. So, inside of htdocs,
Was the 22nd?
yeah, 22nd, let's just grab this whole block, paste her in, there we go. Now in VS Code, all of our stuff is back. So let's take a look at the model. The model is also where you define constants. Now, in theory, you could be loading this thing from a configuration file, external to the PHP. What this would allow you to do is it would allow somebody like the pharmacist or the top level entity to grant additional privileges or revoke privileges to users in these categories. But as in our case, the form of these categories is governed by provincial legislation. So even the top level person in, like the top level group inside of this organization lacks the privilege to modify the categories, right? It would have to be legislators that modify the categories. So, in this case, I'd say hard coding that array, probably fine. So, we call it the ACL, or the access control list. I'm going to capitalize it for no particular reason. So, in our access control list, we want 3 levels. We have pharmacist, pharmatech, nurse, and Phil. Our categories are view, use, refill, and add. Also, it's useful to, when doing these, to just do everything lowercase. That way you don't have to remember what's uppercase and what's lowercase. View, use, refill, and add. So, in the case of a pharmacist, all of these are true. Am I using the wrong braces? I think I'm using the wrong braces. I think they're square braces. That might be why it's complaining so much. we go. And add is true. The nice thing is you can just copy this bit, paste, paste, paste. So you can kind of see how all you would have to do is a JSON encode of this, write it into a file, and that way you can externalize it, right?
Professor, I have a question here.
Certainly.
So we are basically adding everything into everybody's, credentials. If we don't give them that, for example, the pharmacist will have access to everything, so we basically add view, use, refill, add there and add it as a true. But the pharmacist has only access to view and refill, right? So if we added only these two over there and remove the rest, so what would happen?
Basically, you're only making your life more complicated.
Okay.
If you make these things return false or true every time, then you can rely on these, any result you get from here being true or false, which means you can just integrate it easily into Boolean expressions. If you leave stuff out, you don't only have to check for true and false, because you still have to check for true and false, you have to check for set and unset as well,
Oh,
right? Is set, you have to do a secondary check for it. So it's just easier to make sure that the data is actually a rectangle. So pharmatex do not have permission to use, and they do not have permission to add new. Nurses do not have permission to refill, and do not have permission to add. And Orville doesn't have permission to do anything, just look through the glass. Does this make sense? So this way, if we know that our user authentication level is nurse, we can say something like, if session at auth level or something is equal to nurse, or no, I'm doing it incorrectly. If ACL at auth level at refill, display refill button, else don't. Right? We can provide the authorization level as an argument to the access control list. Then if we ask for a particular function, we get a true or a false here. If we get a true, that means this person, whoever they are, has permission to see this. If not, they don't. And we don't have to do big, long switch statements, right? If user authenticated is nurse, then give them this. If user authenticated is pharmacist, give them that. You don't have to worry about that. You can just parameterize the code. Makes it nice, small, compact, easy. Make sense? Any questions? Good. So,
Professor, can I see the code?
oh, yeah,
Just
sorry.
for-
There you go. Sorry, I'll put that back in and I'll comment it out for you.
Thank Yeah.
As usual, all of this code will be posted to tables. So, any other questions? So now we come to the crux of this. So we know we need users, we know we need passwords, we know we need privilege levels, we need a bunch of different things. We store all of this in a table in our database. Credentials, I will be calling it. The other sorts of things that it's useful to contain inside of your credentials database, email addresses. Perhaps the username and email address are the same thing, perhaps they are not. An identification number. In theory, all of your student numbers are unique identification numbers and are probably the primary keys for your student entries in Mohawk's database that has all of your student records, etc. Yes, a sign-up page can allow users to create an account by entering a username and password. So this is another thing that we don't currently have, right? It's necessary also to be able to create a new user, right? Username and password. We then create a new record in the users table, but it's very important that we don't store passwords as plain text strings. So if you want to know how things like this hack in Hamilton are still going on despite the fact that it's more than a month later, yeah. Don't store passwords as plain text strings. So if a database is hacked, and the passwords are stored in plain text, City of Hamilton, the attacker can see them and use them. And particularly if they're an administrator, they can do a lot of damage. Now, can't they? Mayor, whatever her name is. Horvath, Mayor Horvath. Not that she's like the person who would have been responsible for all of this, I suppose, but I sure hope some heads are rolling in City Hall.
There's no jobs posted, so they probably retain all of the people.
Yes, that, yeah. I mean, come on. I kind of feel like if you get the city into a mess like this, you gotta lose your job, right?
They get a promotion.
So, here's a thing, a very naughty thing that many people do that you shouldn't, which is reuse passwords across multiple websites. Users are vulnerable to attacks across different common websites and identity theft. So, let's say, so basically, think about it this way, right? If you're using the same password for a bunch of different websites, right? And you're like, oh, I need to create an account on, Greg McSketchy's horrible used auto parts website or something, right? And then you provide the same username and password that you use on everything else. You are trusting what did I call him, Stinky Pete? You are trusting Stinky Pete's terrible website with your credentials that you use for everything. Even if Stinky Pete himself is trustworthy, you are also putting your faith in the security considerations that he has put in place. So, use different passwords for different websites. If we store passwords in plain text, whoever is working on the application can see them. You shouldn't be able to see someone's password, you as the employee, right? Not all of your employees are trustworthy either, right? Nor should anyone else working on the application see sensitive user information. So the question is, if we are not to store passwords in plain text, even on the server, how on earth do we do it? Passwords are properly stored in an encrypted format using hashing and salting. How many people have heard of hashing before? Not talking about potatoes.
I was talking about Bitcoin.
Oh, okay. Please elaborate.
Oh, I have some.
You have some Bitcoin,
Yes.
and the Bitcoins themselves are, oh, you must be really happy lately.
Well,
How long?
you just hold on to it and watch it rise.
Yeah, but hey, line going up makes you happy, right? Line going down makes you sad. That's what happens when you have some of the thing to which the price changes are applying. Although I think it's been like constant for the last couple of weeks.
It's rising. It's because they're reaching a halving point.
Yes.
Again.
Mm-hmm. Very good. For those of you who are not into Bitcoin, what a Bitcoin is essentially is an encryption key, right? They are based on prime numbers, and there are only so many of them that can exist. And basically they're more or less unguessable. You actually have to run through and test prime numbers to see if they're prime in order to get new Bitcoin keys. And like finding large primes takes a lot of time, basically, because you know what the algorithm is for testing to see if a number is a prime number? You basically have to go through and try to divide it by every single number that came before it, and if it comes out evenly, with any of those, then it's not prime. But if none of those resulted in if none of those resulted in a whole number answer, then the number was not the number was prime in the first place, so that's a prime number. But basically, you know, there might be a few algorithmic tricks to speed it up, but essentially, determining whether a number is prime takes an amount of time proportional to the size of the number, which is why Bitcoin, like when it was like easy ones, like, you know, 3, 5, 7, it took basically no time to find prime numbers. But now that the prime numbers are sufficiently large, it takes quite a long time to find new Bitcoin, which is, and there's like some theoretical maximum number that fit inside of like a 62-bit integer or whatever it is they're using, right? But probably more than 62 bits, but anyway. But that's, so hashing is something a little bit different. So a hash is a one-way encryption function that turns a string into a password. String or password, a password encoded as a string, into an unrecognizable series of characters. For example, pass 123 to this garbage. So the words one way here are incredibly important. We don't have to get into the mathematics of why it's a one-way relationship. But this is fundamentally what sets hashing apart from encryption, right?
Dr. Moore, if it's only one way, how do you go back to the original how do you know what the original password was?
You can't. This information is not sufficient, no longer sufficient to create the original password.
But if the original password was entered and then the computer hashes it into something else, how does it verify the original password because it's been changed?
It's a one-way function that is repeatable. If you put the same number in, you get the same number out. So, excellent question. So,
So it depends on the hashing algorithm, which is going to determine what that output is.
yes,
Got it.
so, at this point, it's useful to review what encryption the bloody hell is, right? So let's say we have some piece of information, like a document, right? Info.info, whatever. When we encrypt, right, we create nonsense, right? Unguessable nonsense. But we have a path back to the original document. The way that encryption works is you need to know the encryption key. If both parties have the same encryption key, this means that you can take a string, like password, encrypt it to produce 7GH open bracket L 7Q lowercase r. You know, some random piece of data, right? You apply the encryption key to be able to encrypt the data. This makes it suitable, for example, for putting in the payload of a post packet, right? HTTP, payloads are encrypted. This is how it works. When it comes back, so there's sort of, this is client, this is internet, this is server. When the server receives the packet, it has agreed with the client about what encryption key it's going to use before the transaction takes place, right? So the server then decrypts the value, getting the original value back. But it needs to know the encryption key. Right? So, I'm sure that when you guys took networking courses, you talked about this type of stuff. Right? So that's encryption. Hashing is like encryption, except it lacks the ability to decrypt. The reason that it does this is basically that imagine you have two sets, right? In encryption, every element of set A maps to exactly one element of set B, right? This implies that you can go backwards, right? If each one of these matches exactly one of these, then each one of these matches exactly one of those, right? So you can reverse the process. And this is encryption. For hashing, you can't make that assumption. So essentially, more than one element of A can map to one element in B. This is fine going in one direction, right? So, you know, let's say in A we had 7 and 5 both map to the capital letter A, right? Here's the question under hashing. Given capital letter A, how do you determine whether it was produced by a 7 or a 5?
You don't?
You can't. Yes, that's the answer. You can't determine which of the two elements of the A set produced the element in the B set. That's why you can't just go back and forth like you can with encryption. Does that make sense? So that's like a quick summary of the mathematical reason for this. So, with hashing, you take something like password, you hash, and it produces a random string, you know, random string. I mean, highly unlikely it would come out to the exact word random string, but non-zero in probability. So, let's say the user enters password to create the account, right? Now, time passes, user enters random string, and we save that to the database. Right? Let's say the user enters password with a U instead of with an O, right? That will hash to something else, right? It won't hash to the exact string that the first one produced, right? So, if you look up the version in the database, right, and you look up the version that the user entered, then you can determine, whammo! True or false? Right? Which means that you have an authentication check. In this particular case, that would come out false. But if they enter the same password again, it hashes to the same value, which means during the Boolean check to see if it's the same password, it comes out true. Bing, bang, boom. That is how you authenticate a user. So, that's what hashing is. Any questions?
Actually, I don't get it because, you know, on the B side,
Mm-hmm.
there is a hash, information is A, then A, where, how can B side know where A comes from?
It can.
Then maybe user 5 doesn't try to log in, but user 7, then how can,
Yeah, so
which one is,
basically, talking about passwords, both 7 and 5 work, because they both hash to the same thing. The trick is, right, in a practical case, what are 7 and 5, right? Because if 7 is your password and everything else that hashes to A is an unguessably long encrypted string, then it's fine, right? It still works. Technically, somebody could crack your password with something other than your password, but because it's an encrypted string, it would take longer than the age of the universe to do so. So it effectively doesn't exist, right? Does that make sense? Good. So that's hashing.
Okay, can we take some break?
Oh, yeah, okay. It's 10:55. The next topic is salting. So,
Salted?
salting, yes. We do not just hash our passwords, we also, like any good potato, we also salt them. Alright, I hereby, by the power vested in me, declare a 20-minute break. Please make optimal use of it. I know I will. Be back here at 11:15, please.
Want to sleep?
So, I want to get into the examples, so I'm gonna try to blast through this as quickly as possible. But we do need to talk about salting. So, the process of salting somewhat resembles adding an encryption key to a hashing process. With encryption, it's really the encryption key that makes everything secure and the unguessability of that key. With hashing, what we do is we add some random characters to the hash, which are called the salt. So if we have a password and we hash that to something, what adding a salt does, password plus salt yields, something else. It'll hash to something completely different, even if there's one character difference. So this helps the unguessability of your passwords, right? So this is a randomly generated series of characters that are stored in the database along with the salted password, or the hashed password. So the process for retrieving your password, right? You can't regenerate the salt because it's random. A new password comes in, you get this out, you take this bit from the database, put it on the password, and then hash that, see if it comes out to the stored password. Fortunately, you don't have to worry about any of this. There are PHP functions that take care of everything for you. But the purpose of this is to protect against a type of attack known as a rainbow table attack. So basically, you can guess what the hashing function is if you give it a bunch of values and see what those values hash to. For example, let's say have a username password combination which is known from some other unsecure site, right? You test that username and that password, then you retrieve the hash. And you can do this because you can just send SQL queries, right? Clients can send SQL queries as well. So if it's just the password and the password's being hashed, then you can get the hash and you can work out what the hash function was from what the hash from this pair. So the purpose of the salt is to scramble this so that you're not dealing with the direct hash of the input password. In theory, the salt stays inside of the database in the server and never leaves it. So it's just adding an extra layer of security. Make sense? Any questions about that? So, as you might expect, password hash, the function, hashes a password. This produces, as its result, a hashed value. Your object is then to add that hashed value to your database. Right? Create a new entry, because this is an operation that happens when you create a new account or you change the account password. Right? So you provide your password in here, and then the second parameter is which hashing algorithm you wish to use. Probably choose something other than default, although default's probably also fine. Then, when we have a new request and we want to verify that somebody has provided a password matching something in the database, we have password verify. It automatically takes the salt out, does that mixing process that I described, and returns a Boolean true or false based on whether the password is a match. So there you go. Any questions about that? We'll do usage examples, of course.
If the salt is randomly assigned, how is it possible that it's going backwards to find out what the actual plain text password is?
The salt is also stored in the database.
Thank you.
Good. Now, let's do some code example. So, let's see what we have so far. Close you. Close you. So this is our example from last week. Let's load it up and see what we have. Oh, by the way, you guys can write this down, but there's a way, you can't really expect the user to know to access my.control.php. There is a special file that you can set on Apache servers called htaccess. It's /htaccess, and with that you can set a rule which redirects all incoming traffic to a particular PHP file, which is, again, how you would do this under MVC. Anyway, so login database. We're going to need an actual database running here. Admin. New. Database name is hospital. Create. Import data. Choose file. Just get our medicines database again. Medicines.sql. Go! There we go. So, inside of hospital, I would like to make a new table for credentials. New. Table name will be credentials. We can add an ID number, make that an auto-incrementing ID number, primary ID. Go, there we go. Username will be, let's set it as a varchar of size 64. Password. Now, here's the thing, right? We need to know how many characters we should store this password using, right? The way to find that out is to look up password hash, because we're intending to use this for hash passwords in the PHP documentation, php.net. Password hash. So there you go. Therefore, it is recommended to store the result in a database column that can expand beyond 60 characters. 255 characters would be a good choice for default password. So there you go. Let's use 255 characters. Consult the documentation. All of your questions will be answered. So, 255. And we also wanted an authorization level, right? Authorization level, let's make that a varchar of 64, why not? Make sense? Good. Save her up. There we go. There we have it. Currently, we have nothing in there, which is fine. Oh. Cancel. All right. Good. We have a credentials database. Now, what we need is we need a way to register new users, right? So let's start with the view. This is our login view. So most of this will be reusable as a registration rather than a login. It's login. Here we go. So, right click, copy, paste, rename, register.view.php. We can So we can modify this file so that it's performing a registration rather than a login. So, for example, we are still wanting to target my.control.php. We still want to use method post. We still need username and password. Submit, we should change the text from login to register. And we need to pass something to the control script that indicates that this is a registration attempt and not a login attempt, right? So, register is equal to true as a get parameter. Make sense? And let's not worry too much about success or failure. Make sense? Good. It would also be useful, login pages typically have this sort of thing. It would be useful to have a link to the registration page on the login page, right? So, link href is equal to register.view.php. New around here, click here to register. Right? So, going to our login page, new around here, click here to register. Ooh, all right. Just try to tighten these up. You see how the underline is including that space? If you tighten up and get rid of those spaces, it makes that link tight to the word, which just looks much better. So, if you click here, you're brought to the registration page instead of the login page, right? But you can still access the same thing. Now, at the moment, the controller is not recognizing the difference between login requests and registration requests. So let's take a look. We are definitely in not logged in mode, right? We will have basically two modes here based on whether register is true or false. Although I should rephrase it to make it look more like the slides, shouldn't I? Let's do action instead of register. So rather than saying register is true, let's say action is equal to register. And rather than saying nothing in login, let's say action here. I put that on the method, what am I thinking? Silly, silly, silly. Ha, I'm glad I looked at it. Action is equal to login. Right? So now, in controller, when we are not in logged in mode, we can switch on get action. So you'll notice that I'm using it directly from the superglobal without filtering it, right? Because all it's being used for is logic operations, there's no danger of it ever being printed to the screen, right? There's no danger of it ever being written directly to the database. So technically speaking, this is safe. It's the same as like using like is set here directly, right? So this is still safe. Case. Login. Great. Case. Register. Great. All of this stuff goes in login. And now, register, we can proceed. So let's just do our same little informational thing. This was an attempt to register. We will need username and password, same as we were taking before. In fact, because this is common to all of these cases so far, we can just pop that above here, or no, sorry, before the switch. Can't put anything there. What am I thinking? There. You can read your parameters up here, and then that, that simplifies both of your cases. We can comment that out as well. That was for debugging. There we go. So, we will need a function in the model which does the same thing as check login, except it's not checking login, it's registering a new user, right? So register user, passing username and password, right? And then, once again, we can, it won't be login success, it will be registration success. And on success, we will want to include not my.view, but typically, you will bring them to the login page. Registration and login, well, it depends. Sometimes they do it in one step, sometimes they expect you to re-log in once you've registered. Let's do that one for now. But you can see how that's a design choice, right? Register.view.php on failure. So there we go. Further, since both of these operations will require us to have these username and password values set, there's no sense entering this data structure if there's not, right? So, I realize I'm doing a fair amount of restructuring here, but So, what I've done, if we're not logged in and username and password have not been provided, we go back to the login page. If they have been provided, we grab those values, we then switch on whichever action is required. In the case of login, we check login. In the case of register, we register a user. and then we redirect to the appropriate page after that. Does this make sense? Any questions?
If, what if I, as a reader, if I thought I registered before, but I hadn't, then which process can I add? For example, go to a local page, and then I typed my username and password. I thought I registered before,
But something went wrong,
yes,
yeah.
and then how, there is a note that kind of process. So you,
Yeah, there's no way
you
to,
are not registered, and so do you want to register something?
yes.
Redirect to
Well-
register page.
So if it doesn't find the username in the database, it should redirect to a register page, except that we're not supposed to provide that much information about who's registered, right? So if you want to be user-friendly, then you redirect to the register page if you detect a username that doesn't exist. If you want to be secure, you just tell them that there was an error. Does that make sense?
One more question.
Of course.
Why did you check action in GET super variable?
Excellent question.
Not just action.
So-
Because so far we just use action, GET action.
So it has to do with how the parameters are being sent. If you notice, the action is being included as a query parameter on the URL under action. Despite the fact that these two things are encrypted and in the payload, that is not. It's a get parameter. So I'm sending both get and post parameters at the same time.
Because of the user and password information?
Yeah, well, this stuff should be in the encrypted payload because it's username and password. But the particular action that's being performed is not that interesting to a hacker, right?
Yes.
So it doesn't need to be a post parameter. And it's quite easy to just slip a parameter here as opposed to like formulating an AJAX. The other way of doing this would be to disable the submit button, have that redirect to a JavaScript AJAX call that does set that query parameter in a way that's like invisible in the HTML, but like there's not really a point to doing that if this is that much easier. You know? Let me show you what this looks like in terms of network traffic. Mr. Krabs, password is unregistered. So, the payload contains username, password, right? In the header though, interesting. Looks like it is putting it in the URL. Wait, did I reload this? I may not have reloaded it. Action is login. Good. Payload includes, there you go. All right, I just haven't reloaded the page. So our string query parameter is login, right? Our form data are these two things. These are in the encrypted payload.
Not encrypted.
I'm pretty sure they're encrypted. So the way that we can tell for sure, first let me just put register user. in the model so that it stops complaining. Function. Placeholder. So in the controller, and this is primarily for the purposes of demonstration, echo get plus JSON encode the get array plus break.
Those were done.
Oh yeah, there we go. I've been teaching too much Java this term. Right, let's just see what's in the get and post arrays. So you can see get has action login, post has username and password. So, and that only happened because like it redirected me to the, I really should put like headings on those things so that I know which ones log in and which ones register easily. Heading 1, register. Log in. So, good. So everything works. User registration and login checks are now our primary ticket. We need to query the database in various ways. So, we are already querying the database, so it makes sense to copy this. Let's register the user first. So, we are not inserting into medicines, we are inserting into credentials, right? The particular fields, you can look these up right here. We've got user name, or I guess it will be you, key, and we need an auth level. Forgot about that. That's okay, we can throw that in. So, into credentials, we are inserting into username, password, and auth level values given. Make sense? So,
If you check the auth level and in a login or and register page, we need to add some information about that.
we do, yeah. We need to add something to the form that indicates what level we're registering a user at. The alternative to that is to write something where somebody, like an administrator, can go in and give people privileges manually. Like, under this system, anybody can just make themselves a pharmacist. So it's not secure in that way, but it's an in-class example, right? But there is one thing I wanted to do before we go any further. Registration success should be set to true, right? Save. So, let's go back to register. We need some way of entering in an authorization level. Now, because we're sort of swapping between different distinct things, probably the correct thing to do here would be a radio box, right? But those take time, and I'm trying to keep things, you know, you would do that, I'm not gonna do that, it takes time. So, occupation, I'll say. And input type will be text. Name will be off. Just like that, right? So this puts it on the user to guess the exact string that we're using inside of the server to represent these things, which is bad design, but it's quick design for an in-class example. So we now need to take that information as well. That information is not present in all cases. Login is not going to have it, only register. So we need to take that information from the user, call it level, or even just L, provide that as well, and, or I suppose I should do A, shouldn't I? A for authorization level. There. Does this make sense? So far so good? So we pass username, password, and authorization level to the registered user. Registered user calls this guy. This is our SQL query. We execute with the passed parameters. Note that the names can and will be different than what's being used in control. It then passes back as its result. I suppose it's not always true, is it? Registration success is the result value, right? So, register user, go to register, go to control. So we get register user, right? On registration success, we proceed to log in, otherwise we're stuck at register. So, let's see if this works. First, I need to delete my cookie. It currently considers me logged in, so I gotta delete this guy. There we go. Now, accessing my.control.php redirects to login. Notice get and post are both blank. Login, we have nothing. And if we take a look at the database, currently empty. So, even if we wanted to log in, well, we haven't done the login authorization part yet. It's just passing everything through login, so let's leave that for now. Click here to register. Register. Username, Mr. Krabs. Password, money. Occupation, pharmacist. Register. Uh-oh. Thanks, Google. I'm teaching a class. Change your password. The password you just used was found in a data breach, and Google Password Manager recommends you changing your password now. Okay, thank you. Goodness. Okay, so fatal error, call to a member function, error on null. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, I bet I didn't set up the database. Let's see here. Session start, PPL. Absence filter.
It says line 39.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Take a look. Line 39 in my model. Yeah. Connection, global connection. App.config. Oh, yeah, that's it. So previously, I did this in the last class, we only needed an access to the database if we had a logged in user. But now we're trying to access the database without a logged in user, so just get rid of that. Yeah. There. Save. Back. Register. There we go. Undefined index. Registration success. Okay. Line 55. Registration success. Right, did I misspell it? No. Well, you can also do it that way. Assuming this isn't returning a null. So, this was an attempt to register the user. We didn't get any errors. So, taking a look. Still nothing, eh? What do you call it again? Credentials. Maybe I'm including funny characters and I shouldn't be. There we go. Take out the hyphen. have known by the fact that we didn't get the login page. So it's redirected to the login page, which means that this attempt to register did result in a login. So, in theory, there we go. Ta-da! Our database entry has been made. Cool. So, and only with a minimum of messing around with them. Good. So, now, let's concern ourselves with how do you implement the login, right? Oh. Okay. We'll do the basic version, and then we'll upgrade to the hashed version. Okay? You'll notice that in our database, password is currently being stored in plain text. Not what we want, but let's get this working, and then we can upgrade to hashing. So, check login. Once again, we want our connection to exist. We probably don't want that to be the case, at least not yet. Success will probably not always be the case. So, we need to prepare a statement for the database. So, what do we want to pull from the database?
Password.
Yes, what is the password contained in?
String.
Yes, but which record is it contained in? How do we know which record the password we're looking for is in? How do we know where it is?
Select.
We're definitely doing a select query, that's true. Select star from credentials. Where?
Password.
Well, see,
Usually.
username, that's right. We want to pull the entry from the username, right? Where user name is equal to question mark. Where username is the thing we provide. Not sewer, user. There we go. So, in this type of operation, if result comes out false, then it was a failure to establish a connection to the database, which should still be a failure, right? So, if result is equal to false, then this is login failure. Right?
Actually, others are false. And,
Oh, triple equals is strict equality comparison. So result will return exactly the Boolean value false. If I don't include that, this will also match against things like null and 0.
so after the student has to apply as well, then how can we get the results as false? It means.
So this is whether or not this operation succeeded.
Just to succeed in.
Yeah. The actual data is contained in the statement object. Statement object fetch. might just look up the documentation quickly. So fetch all will get all of the records which matched the query. Technically, we're probably only interested in one, as users should not be allowed to register multiple times with the same username. But because we haven't built that in, let's just use fetch, it's easier. Fetch. So, all good. Statement, arrow, fetch will return the row that we are retrieving. So, we can store that as, say, record. And then we want to see if record at password is the password that was provided. But just to prove that everything's working so far, let's echo JSON info record. Let's see what we're actually retrieving. I don't recommend doing this in a release version. But it's good for debugging. So, Mr. Krabs and money. Log in. There we go. There is our record. Ta-da! So, our username points to Mr. Krabs. Password points to money. So the reason for these numbers is that it's also it's a PHP thing. It's like if you want to access these values positionally, you can do that, or if you want to access them by name, you can do that. It provides both options. So for our purposes, we can say if leave that in. If record and password is equal to the passed password, this constitutes login success. Otherwise, this constitutes login failure. Does anybody mind if I turn the thing off? I think it's getting warm enough in here. So, let's see if this works. Log in. Username blank, password blank. This was an attempt to log in. The result was false. And we're also getting this error again. I'll fix that later. Let's enter Mr. Krabs' password is wrong. Log in. Password is wrong. We get this guy, right? But we still, I think I need to fix that now. Line 44, you say. That should clear that. So we're still on the login page, but if we provide the correct password, log in, yes, you'll notice this is new medicine entry, medicines list, and we have a couple of errors. For some reason the TPO isn't like firing up. It's weird. Do I have to like say global TPL? Maybe that's what's missing. Yeah, that's totally what was missing. Okay, I can flip these back then. So, good. So, this password matched the one in the database. So, we established our session, our user validation in the session. We're now in to our medicine view that we had before. So, we now have a working password system. So, let us now take a moment, upgrade it, so that we are now storing hashed passwords. Okay? First, I'm going to delete this because it's a non-hashed password. Good. Now, going to the model. See, this is the convenient part, right, of using MVC architecture. You don't have to worry about messing around in the view. You don't have to worry about messing around in the controller. It's a database operation. You know where it is. It's in the model. So.
It's in the model or it's in control?
It's in the model.
Model?
Yeah. Everything that interacts with the database is in the model.
Model.
Yeah. The controller is just deciding. It's just taking inputs from the user and selecting which view to do. And like calling things from here. So, when we register a user, we don't want to just use P. We want to hash that password. So, we can say hash is equal to password hash. Yes. Now, you can choose a different password algorithm constant. If you want, bcrypt, argon 2i, etc., etc., etc. Password default is fine, because this is just us, just among friends. So you can use password default there. This is the hashing algorithm. So this thing is already salting. It's salting and hashing. That's not a separate step. You just do it this way. Make sense? So, now we provide hash instead of the password to the database here, right? Because we want to actually send the hash to the database. Save, 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 save. Now, let's delete our session cookie. It would be oh so convenient to have a logout button, wouldn't it? Delete our session cookie. Let's just clear any form data that we were entering. We have our login, register, username, Mr. Krabs, password, money, occupation, pharmacist, lowercase p. There we go. We're now presented the login page, but let's take a look at the database.
Oh.
Exactly. So now, instead of the plain text, I thought I had deleted you.
Yeah.
Oh, you did too.
Maybe it got re-entered. I don't
Maybe.
know. Delete again. Yes. There. So there's our hashed password, right? Obviously, if I try to compare the string money to this, that's going to result in failure. So what we need to use is password verify. It's as easy as it could possibly be. In our check login, all we do is replace this guy with password verify. First is the password, which in this case is called pass, I believe. Pass, there it is. Second, the hash, which is record at password. And that's it. Security. So, let's verify that this works. There we go. And it worked. I'm still getting these though. Oh, I know what it is. If you're loading the view, then you need to pull the records. Yes, I know what was happening. We need to do this. Pull that. Pull this. Lost my place. There we go. Because the thing it's complaining about is here I was going to the view without like getting the medicines first. So that's why it wasn't populating the table, because it had nothing to populate it with, because I didn't connect that stuff. So, yeah. There we go. So, pretty good, right? Not bad. So that's a password system with hashing. Any questions? Shall Shall we make a logout button? Okay. So obviously you can only log out if you're already logged in. Let's go to my view, which is where all of the table stuff is. We've got a thing where it welcomes the user. Let's add the button to log out, like on the same line or immediately below it. Button. Oh. Do buttons have an action? I don't want to do any JavaScript. Do buttons have an action? Okay. So, the URL that we want to access is going to be the controller again, and we want to send an action logout, right? So, form action is my control.php, action is logout. And then the button text goes inside the button. There we go. Reloading the page. We get a logout button now. Clicking it. Oh man, I think I've been lied to. It's okay, I'll just change it to an input type. Put this in the form. Put it in a form. A little form containing only itself. There we go. Save, refresh, continue. There we go. You can see. Boom. Supposed to be getting something there. Oh, maybe it's because I didn't specify method. Oh, there it is. Had to be post for some reason. Okay, we've got action logout now. Good. So, in the controller, This is everything for insertion, right? So, switching on action. Actually, here, let's make it universal. Because I think here it's called act, not action. There we go. That'll do. In the controller, action in case of post, this is what it does. Case log out, right? Break. Session destroy. Now, if session has been destroyed, we probably don't want to view myview.php. So why don't we grab that, throw that in, the version, like the operation that it's relevant to. And here, we can include login.view.php. We'll kick them back to the login screen, right? Save. All right. There it worked. So I sent log out and it kicked me out to the login screen. If I enter Mr. Krabs and money, log in, I know. There we go. Here's all of our stuff. Log out. There it is. And you can see that our session cookie has been reestablished, but let's go through that procedure one more time, and I'll prove to you that is now a new session cookie that's just been reestablished. Okay? So, we log in, watch the session cookie value. Hasn't changed, right? Now, we log out. Action, log out. Oh. Okay, I thought that it would change. Interesting. Am I doing it right?
You didn't click log out for this session.
Let me try again. So log out.
Oh, no,
Brings
log.
it back. Huh. Fine. I'll do it manually. Regenerate ID. There. Regenerate ID has regenerated the ID. Probably a good idea,
Sir,
but I don't know why like in theory that should have
destroy.
destroyed it. I'm not sure why it's continuing that way. But anyway, you can get there by other means. Okay, any questions about logging out? So let's now use our authorization list to restrict what it is that people can do. So you want to do this on two fronts. First, if an operation in the model is called and the user is not authorized to perform it, you should prevent them from doing so. Second, and this is actually secondary, someone shouldn't see the controls to do that in the first place, right? So in our case, inside of my.view.php, we have this form which adds a new medicine to the database. This thing should only be seen by people who have permissions to see it. That is to say, only pharmacists, right? So, let's check the model first, because I have a feeling I'm not setting that in the TPL or in the session cookie. Yep. So you're going to need to include the authorization level, right? Auth level will be stored in record. And I forget what I called it. I think it's just auth level. There we go. Just for the sake of interest, up here, let's also view what the session contains. Yeah? So, in the view, if session at auth level is equal to, or sorry, session at auth level is the input. We want the ACL at the auth level at the privilege we're looking for is, remember, add. So now, all of this stuff is inside of an if block that will only show it if auth level add is true, which means that the person is a pharmacist. Say. So logging in as Mr. Krabs, log in. You'll see that the form appears for him. If we log out, register a new user, say SpongeBob, password is I'm ready. Occupation is fry cook. No, that's what he is in the show. SpongeBob will be a nurse. There we go. SpongeBob, password is I'm ready. Log in. You'll notice there is SpongeBob. He doesn't get the list. He doesn't get the form to add a medicine. Good! Because he shouldn't. He doesn't have authorization. That said, if he knows enough about the server, right? Like, for example, action post, and, you know, you can get some of this stuff from the, well, here, I'll show you a trick. A nasty trick. Post and view, let's see here. med equals fake, and quantity is equal to 2, and narc is equal to true. That's a shame. That should have worked. I should have been able to hack my own thing. Come on. Oh, it needs to be sent by post. Okay. I think it does. Yeah, it's probably looking for it in the wrong place. Yeah, has to be sent by post parameter. Which means that you can't just do it niftily from the URL, you'd have to use an AJAX request, which you can totally do from the console, from the JavaScript console. But anyway, if I had encoded things correctly as post parameters rather than get parameters, SpongeBob, our dear nurse, would still be able to add medicines because we have not yet restricted it in the model. So let's do that. We have a function, insert entry. We should probably name that something a little bit more close to what it actually does now that we have a larger, more complicated system. We're not just inserting entries, we are adding medicine, right? Here, there we go. Now, if ACL at session at auth level add, then you can do all of this. Oh, and that should probably be done first. And in fact, since we're using ACL, that's included in this list here. You could probably do all that on one line, but you know, whatever.
I'm sorry, why did you declare global TPL here? Because TPL,
To prevent it redeclaring it at the local level
in this function, TPL already
isn't used.
is used.
It was a precaution. Yeah. Yeah, that was I may at some point want to, right? Instead of relying on return result, for example, I could add something to the TPL, in which case that will become useful. So, only adds if they have the correct authorization level. Else, return false. And in fact, there we go. In fact, if you hit this case, as an administrator, you should probably say, someone's trying to do something they shouldn't be allowed to do. Right? Like if you hit this if statement, this case of this if statement, that means someone has tried to add a new medicine without using the interface that you designed. Which means they're trying to hack your system. So you might want to just kill everything right there, you know, make a little arm come out of their computer and torch it, you know. Send in the Marines, you know. So, although that's an American expression. So, does that make sense? So far so good? Good. So, you can see how, like, at various levels, this would be true of various different things, right? If you wanted to if you wanted to do things like, right now, the only interaction we have with the database is to add a new medicine. Nurses should be allowed to, you know, withdraw a certain amount of medicine, right? All of those functions would be functions in the model, looking somewhat like this, right? Performing some kind of database query, guarded by whether or not the person has the correct authorization level, right? And like, you see the advantage of using this as opposed to like listing the professions inside this if statement, right? Like, what if you wanted to add a new one? What if you wanted to add a new level and give it specific permissions, right? Using it this way, you don't have to change anything. You don't have to change a thing here to be able to allow that new stuff. Whereas if it's like you wanted to allow, you know, say you add doctor to the list, and doctors are like given similar permissions to pharmacists, or I know not all doctors are the same, but you know, let's imagine, right? If this was, you know, if auth level is equal to pharmacist, everywhere that occurs you would have to say or auth level is equal to doctor, and you'd have to carry that change through everywhere in the code. And that is something we hate to do because it generally, it's difficult to remember to do consistently in all of the places. It leads to bugs, it's buggy design. There's actually a word for it. It's called an anti-pattern. So like, it's a pattern that's bad instead of a pattern that's good. It's an anti-pattern. So, any questions about that? Anything anybody wants to see me try to bang out in 6 minutes?
Probably I might need your help with the PHP MyAdmin database.
Okay.
We downloaded here.
Oh, no, you get it for free through XAMPP.
I have an XM.
Okay. Manage servers, MySQL database, configure. Oh, no. So the other way to do it, localhost /phpMyAdmin.
Okay, perfect, that's it.
Yep, that's it.
I will save that.
Do so.
I forgot.
So, if there's nothing further, I think that's everything. Enjoy Good Friday. I'll see you next week.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter. We just, I'll put this up on Canvas.